Okay, well, welcome to the March 2022 Planetarium Zoom seminar. Today we have Dr. Jenny Shipway, who leads the planetarium in Winchester Science Center. Is that still correct?
No, I left a few years ago.
Oh, okay.
So...
Okay, that's old news. Okay. But she will be talking about her subject, edumyths, popular education misconceptions. And before I hand it over to you, I want to mention that for those of you here, we do have a sign-in sheet. It's called the chat. And so if you can put in your name and where you're from, that would be much appreciated. And without further ado, Jenny.
Okay, I'll give you a minute to sign in as well while I get my slides up. And I want to make sure that when I am screen sharing, I can still see you and the chat box as well.
Looks good.
Bring the chat back up. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about edumyths, and the way this is going to work, I've broken it up into sort of 5 parts. So I'm going to first off just introduce myself a little bit and talk about what do I mean by an edumyth. And then I've got 3 myths that I'm going to use as exemplars. First myth is going to think around why do we believe these myths at all? The second one is about how belief can trump evidence with myths we already believe, especially. And thirdly, trying to think about how do we know if a myth is true or it's a myth? What does learning success actually look like? And then at the end, we're going to have a decent module time for discussion and any questions you might have. And you might see at the bottom of the screen, there's a little timeline there that I'll light up as we go along. So you can remind yourself how far through we are. If you get bored, then you can be sure the end is near. So this is going to be talking about education myths, but also general misinformation as well, because it's obviously all connected in terms of psychology. So to start off, a little bit about me. So as you're aware, I'm in England. I'm in the city of Winchester in southern England. So it's a lovely little medieval city that was really, really important about 1,000 years ago. And through medieval times as well, we've got a socking great big cathedral and a really nice planetarium. So I came here in 2007 when the planetarium launched an existing science centre, a 17-metre digital dome. And I was the only new member of staff. By the time I left 10 years later, we had a whole team for the planetarium, and I was heading education across the whole centre. But since then, I've been an independent consultant, done all sorts of bits and pieces. So as well as running the planetarium, other things I've been doing are I've been treasurer and then president of the British Association of Planetaria. And their conference is in early September, and they're really, really good crowd of people. So I'd recommend it. It's very cheap to join if you want to come to the conference. I run a national project called AstroBoost, which gets funding and resources to amateur astronomical societies to do outreach. I've worked as a consultant on a load of full dome films and written the script for 2 that are coming out this spring. That's Forward to the Moon from Fisk and Moonbase from Moonraker. And I'm also a member of the IPS Education Committee, and I'm in the research subcommittee. And this is really what has brought all this on, because since COVID, I had a bit of spare time and I started really getting into reading through the literature of educational research. And it's one of those things you really need a bit of time to do. And I certainly never had time when I was running the planetarium. But what I did was I learned a lot very rapidly. And I learned loads of things that I wish I'd known when I was there, lots of really useful information. But the problem is it's not easy to find always. So ever since, like any new convert, I've become very evangelistic about trying to share some of the things that I've learned and also kind of help people more easily access useful information where they can start their own learning through this. So education myths today, and what I mean by that is something about an education learning concept. So some sort of concept about how we learn, or good classroom practice, or something to do with education. And specifically today, I'm going to be talking about learning of knowledge and skills, and sort of semantic knowledge. So not getting rich sensory memories, but rather learning chunks of information in a more academic way. To be a myth, of course, it needs to have been clearly discredited by research, but yet still be really popular and found all over the internet, and loads of people getting very excited telling you should use it. So this is a really good bit of just misinformation, misconceptions. You know how sticky they can be in astronomy. Basically, I'm talking about the education equivalent of moon phases are caused by the Earth's shadow. We know that's not the case. Loads of people know, there's lots of evidence, yet still lots of people believe it. So myth number one, I'm going to think about why do we believe these things at all? And I've called it the corrupted cone, because this myth is, this one has nothing good to say for it, because it's basically just brazenly made up. It's not a kind of over-egged kind of idea. It's just, no, it's bad. So here is a nice example. There's lots of different examples. This is a particularly good one that I found and I want to look at. And I'm not going to kind of be picking fun at the people who made the image, because I strongly suspect they were just copying someone else's image when they made this. But the idea with this, the cone or pyramid, often known as the learning pyramid or the cone of learning here, is that you have different ways of learning, different routes to learning, reading, hearing, seeing, and that in this version, after 2 weeks, very specific, we remember this amount of information. So what I thought I'd do is I'm just going to shut up for a minute and let you look at this. And if you just want to throw into the chat box any red flags you see. So if you have your scientific, analytic, fact-checking head on, if you look at this, is there anything about it that makes you suspicious of its veracity? So just throw any idea in the chat box. This is so cool. You're saying like all the right things. Okay, I'll give you a tiny bit longer. Ooh, that's a good one. Okay, this is really nice because you've pulled up a lot of the same ones that occurred to me, but also some additional ones as well. I I really like the idea of how do you quantify 100% of what you see? That's a really good question. How are people tested? Okay, I'm going to bang out the ones that occurred to me. This is all pre-programmed, so I can't add in the ones that you said. Things that occurred to me. So firstly, someone said, where did the numbers come from? And they are suspiciously round. If you did some research study and came back with these numbers, would anyone believe you? Why are they all rounds of 10? It's very suspicious. We, who are we? Is it the same for everybody? Are you going to remember the same as me? Who are they talking about? How much variation is there between people? And then also the point someone made, so the variation between people, someone made the point about prior knowledge, which is another, as well as your intrinsic self, also your prior knowledge. And we tend to, so what's that mean? Like if I read a notice in the dentist, like a poster in the dentist while I'm waiting, am I going to remember as much of that as if I read something that I need for a test tomorrow? But how much variation is there between different times of day, different motivations? 1969, that's a long time ago, isn't it? So if this is so important, why hasn't anyone done any research more recently on it? Why isn't there a more recent reference with perhaps more exact numbers on it as well? 90%, hands up if you remember 90% of what you say and do, because if you do, you're very special, because that's not how the human brain works. We're really good at forgetting stuff, and it's really important that we do forget things, and no one remembers, well, maybe some people, but vanishingly few people could possibly remember that. Edgar Dale, this is interesting. If you actually look up that reference, and it's a book, so it's not easy to look up, you would find that he never said this. And there's a number of like 6 or so references that tend to get stuck onto it, but this is not his. Some of these items are weird as well. They don't seem to quite fit. So looking at an exhibit, why isn't that under C? Why is that under C and here? And some of them just seem slightly odd. And having read about learning in psychology and things, the difference between reading and hearing words is you remember twice as much as you hear as you read. They're both going in the phonological loop. They're both going in the same way into your working memory. So why are they so different? Also, for me, a massive red flag was the fact they divided it up here. And again, this isn't on everyone, between passive and active. And someone made the point in the chat about how mentally active you are while you're doing these activities being crucial. And I suspect that this particular version has been made from someone who has something that they want to sell. And it's to do with the idea of active education. And when they say active education, what they mean is physically active, that you can see someone physically moving. But for learning, really what you need is mental activity. And physical activity can give you a clue as to what people are thinking, but you can certainly have one without the other. And if I imagine, we've all seen activities where people are very physically active, but not thinking about the topic they're meant to be learning at all. And you could be quietly reading a book and learning a great deal. So this is all bunkum. And I feel very sorry for Edgar Dale, who now probably is most famous for this bit of misinformation. So I'll just show you what he actually said, partly where this came from. So this is a simplified version of it I copied a different one for this, so the numbers are different. But same thing, percentages with these made up retention rates. Now this is actually what Dale did. He made what he called the cone of experience. And it's got similar kind of subheadings down your pyramid in a similar kind of, you can see a connection there, quite a few more of them. But he doesn't have any percentages because it's nothing to do with how much you remember. It's nothing to do with what is a good way of teaching. In fact, what he was trying to do is point out the levels of abstraction. So if you have a real living experience, it's very concrete, you're literally experiencing it. If you have visual symbols near the top there, you might have pictures of real life objects. And if you have verbal symbols, then it's so abstract that if you imagine an alien would have no idea of what our language was, it's completely abstract from reality. And he never meant that one was better than the other for learning. But what he was doing was just drawing attention to the fact that these different things that we do happen to have different levels of abstraction. And that's something we should bear in mind and think about. And it's not meant to be a way of designing learning. He said himself that people shouldn't take this too seriously. It was just like a way of a starting place for thinking. But someone stole this cone and stuck a load of numbers on it. And there's a wonderful paper that I'll give you a list of references later. There's a paper where someone actually traced back the history of this edumyth. And they traced those numbers all the way back to, I think it was 1890. And there was someone all the way back then had this idea about education that, we remember different amounts of things. And then much more recently, it was stuck onto Dale's cone as a way of giving it a false pedigree. So it's an amazing story, in fact. It shows how sticky this myth is, that these people got so exasperated with it that they did all this huge amount of research into its history. But anyway, it's all fake. So the question is, why on earth would anyone believe this? I mean, you picked out a load of red flags as soon as you looked at it. Why do people fall for this sort of misinformation and pass it on? And it's the same for education myths as other things. So there's various psychological things that will drive it. So the first thing, obviously, is just a lack of fact checking. And it turns out most of the decisions we make in life, we work on gut instinct, on kind of insightful thought. And that's really sensible, because if we analytically fact checked everything in our lives, life would be very, very complicated. So quite often we think we're being analytical when we're not. We do a huge amount on instinct. And if you do it on instinct, you're more likely to fall for misinformation. So even something as simple as saying to people before you show them it, saying, think like a fact checker, that will make people they can then more easily spot misinformation, just giving them that little prod. Also, if you trust the person telling you, you're more likely just to believe it. So if they are a member of the elite, they're powerful, they're attractive, they're a member of your own in-group, you're more likely just to believe it. If it fits with your prior knowledge about the subject and it fits with your general worldview, your religion, your politics, then it's easy to accept it. It's not going to rock any boats. Ooh, come back. If it sounds familiar, you're more likely to believe it. This is on a very serious note, don't retweet disinformation, because even if you retweet it with a note saying this is fake, people will see it, and then the next time they see it, it'll look more familiar and they'll be more likely to believe it. And they'll forget that where they saw it and that you'd flagged it as fake. Just any sort of familiarity will make them more likely to believe. If it's easy to process in your working memory, you're more likely to believe it. And if it has reasonable links to topical memories. So things like if you told me that Dalmatians are particularly friendly dogs, and I had a memory of seeing someone patting a Dalmatian, then the fact I could link those things would make me more likely to believe you. And an oddly specific one to end on. Oh no, wait, there's one more. Emotional mood. If you're happy, you're more likely to believe things. Or if you're angry and feeling socially excluded, you're more likely to believe conspiracy theories. So emotion matters. And my oddly specific one is if the thing is useful to avoid harm. So our brains are hungry for certain things. And one of the things our brains are hungry for is simple pieces of practical advice about how to avoid harm. So if you tell someone a story that, my dad tripped down the stairs on a bit of carpet, that's the sort of thing that sticks in people's heads. And then they're more likely to check their own carpet and make sure they don't have the same fate. So anyway, this is not about just education myths. This is about all sorts of misinformation. And these are the ways that, these are the reasons that people will believe the cone of knowledge and just pass it on. They're not doing the fact checking, they're happy, it fits with their worldview. They've probably got it from a good source, or they trust Edgar Dale, his name is on it, it must be wonderful. And it's also useful to avoid harm, because I think educators really care And the thought that you're excluding certain members of the classroom or that you're not teaching as well as you could really matters. And so people are very drawn to education myths for this reason. Myth 2. This is about belief over evidence. So even when there is evidence, some people will kind of make big efforts to not give up their belief in a myth. And learning styles, I expect you've all heard of. I will explain what it is, but it's probably the most famous of all education myths, incredibly popular. And for those who don't know, the idea is that you can define yourself as being one of, it's usually 4 types of learner. So the idea is that it's a myth, it's not real, but the idea is that you learn best if you do either visual or auditory or kinesthetic or reading and writing. And that you can divide people up into these 4 groups, and then they will learn best if you give them materials through that mode. It's not true, but it's really seductive, and people love being put in boxes. And I think one of the reasons why this myth is just so sticky and so popular is just how much people are drawn to this idea that something like a little questionnaire can tell you about yourself. So in your mind, you have your self-concept, your idea of who you are. And we start building that from when we're little. And you want to know, like, am I brave? Am I clever? Am I sporty? All of these things. And anything that can tell you about yourself and help you self-define gets really stuck in your brain. It's really hungry for it. And it also finds it hard to let it go once it's in there. So like if you want someone to, a class of small children, if you want them to remember the name of one planet, give them a choice and let them choose their favorite. And if they've self-defined as this is my favorite planet, they're more likely to remember it than if you just give them a random planet. Of course, there are people who can help you build up your self-concept and give you lots of wonderful information you can stick in there. And astrology is hugely popular, but partly for this reason. But the thing that interests me is, as well as the people who are true believers, there are a lot of people who will read their astronomy column, their astrology column, and not actually take action based on it. So they'll read it every single week, but they won't let it affect their decisions. And I think people love even just having a starting place for thinking about who they are. So they can ignore the bits they don't like, which the brain always does anyway. If it doesn't agree with your worldview, then you'll just pretend you never read it. And they can keep the bits they do like and stick it all in there. And even, at least with astrology, at least it pretends to be proper, but people will do this with anything. So I looked through my Facebook and pulled out some of the things my friends had posted. I've covered the names for reasons of shame here. But if you touch the banana, you can find out if you're a cheater or a keeper. No one believes this is real. No one. Yet, don't you want to touch the banana? Yes, you do, because we're just drawn towards this stuff and it's good fun. But you get this little paragraph of text about who you are, and you can ignore the bits you don't like, focus on the bits you do like, brush up your self-concept. It's really popular. So learning styles, it lets you do this. It gives you a little box. And I should say, if you haven't already self-defined as one of these learning styles, do not do it, because once you've done it, it'll be in there forever. You can't get rid of it. And it may in some way affect your future behavior. And it's a myth, it's not real. So the version that is so popular today is a kind of souped up version of one that was developed by Neil Fleming in 1987. So it had been kind of washing around a little bit with general ideas. But he formalized it and made a nice questionnaire that people could do. And we ended up with these 4. And where it came from was he had observed a lot of class teaching. And he was fascinated by the way that some teachers would reach certain children, but those same children wouldn't be reached by other teachers. And it's really interesting. And he thought about it and he had this idea that maybe it was because those children had specific learning styles that weren't being met. And it's a really good thought. It's a great hypothesis, worth studying, and research studies took place and they rejected the idea. And really a lot of research studies, because this is the myth that refuses to die. So it's been researched over and over again, many more times than you might expect. There are some studies that show a small effect, many more that show no effect. Some show negative effect. All the most powered up studies show no effect. It's really clear, yet it still remains really popular. So in preparation for this talk, I went a little bit of digging and I found some of Neil Fleming's responses to the criticism of learning styles, which is really interesting actually to see how he was defending it, because it's a big deal. There's lots of people who will defend it. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by this and how it's been rejected, because I think he's kind of wheedling around the main issue here a bit. So what does it claim? So firstly, it claims there are different styles of learning. In reality, most things that actually happen are a mixture of these. But yes, I could give you something to read, or I could have you listen to a podcast of exactly the same text. So yes, you can divide things up in this way in some circumstances. People have preferred styles. Yes, they do. If you ask people which style they are, most people will self-define as one, or you can get them to do a questionnaire, tell them which they are. They're quite accepting of that. People are very happy to say they have a preferred style. And when they learn in their preferred style, in comparison to when they're learning in a different style, and this is from research studies, people report that they've learned more when they've done it in the style that they self-identify as. But for me, the crux of this is, do people learn more when using their style? Do they really learn more? And here there's a massive, big fat no. No, they don't. And this, I think, is really important. I read the thing from Neil Fleming that I read, and he may have written something like this year that I've completely missed. But what he was arguing at that time was that although the study showed no actual learning gain, the fact that people preferred doing it meant it must be good, and therefore the teachers should do this and ensure each child got the right sort of learning. And I would hugely disagree with that, because, you know, people sell this stuff to schools and it takes time of the teacher. Teachers don't have time and money to be spending on things that are shown not to be effective. And also what they have found is that in many cases, it depends on the subject. Certain subjects are taught particularly well through different styles. I mean, normally you use a mixture anyway, don't you? But the teacher should be using the styles that are best for that topic. And whether the child prefers the style or not is not so important. I mean, using a mix is great. It's good if it makes you think about different ways of teaching, but trying to match with children. I mean, Neil Fleming himself said that it's learning preferences, not that they learn better. And he said that you shouldn't try to match the teaching style to the children. So I'm not sure what's left if you take these things away. And, go back. So this is interesting that people are reporting learning more, even though they don't. And that's a large part, I think, again, of learning style success, is that people who try it, the students report, yes, this is brilliant, we love it, we're learning more, even though they're not. And that brings me on to myth 3.
Jenny?
Yes.
I forgot to ask at the beginning, do you field questions during your talk or afterwards?
I think afterwards will be easier for me, to be honest. I can see some people are writing in the box, but I find it very hard to read it while I'm in full flow.
Okay.
Maybe I'll stop. I could do some questions now. What have I missed? Hang on, I can't see any questions.
Well, no, the reason I asked is because I have a question.
Okay, what's your question?
Well, is there a value in enjoyment for people who like a particular learning style, even though they don't actually learn more?
Yeah, maybe it's like a motivational thing. It depends how much effort you want to put into doing it for everybody. Maybe, I mean, motivation's different. I'm specifically talking about learning skills and knowledge in this talk. Maybe, I think using a mixture is good. Everyone likes a mixture, don't they? And you trying to match it to context of what you're teaching. But the idea of, when I was in the first science center I worked in, I came across learning styles, I think at a conference, and it was this thing, oh, you have to do something for each type of learner in each activity. And I just remember for some activities, it was always ended up with, we need to do something for the kinesthetic learners. And then you'd have some sort of pointless motion in a context where it wasn't actually that useful. I mean, obviously it can be really useful, but it's the shoehorning in of it. And it's just the thing that makes me really annoyed about it. Okay, I'll get grumpy and controversial, is that my theory is a lot of 10-year-old boys get marked up, you know, wriggly 10-year-old boys get marked up as kinesthetic learners because they can't sit still. And if you're trying to learn trigonometry, then having diagrams written down is really useful, and doing stuff with your body might be interesting, actually, now I'm thinking about it. But they should be taught in the best way for that topic, not given a different version. If they're learning music, they should be taught it through listening, you know, and the normal mixture. I just feel like some kids are being compromised in their learning if they're being forced into what's been defined as their own learning style. It depends. I mean, different people use the information in different ways. So you can always straw man some sort of terrible classroom which doesn't actually exist. But I just think there's so little time and effort in all of this. The doing stuff kids enjoy to motivate them is great. But having everyone in your class fill in a 16-question questionnaire and then telling them that they're a type of learner, which will then affect their study habits for the rest of their academic career, I'm not sure that's necessarily useful. Myth 3. So this leads on from the idea that it's kind of hard to know that people think they've learned when they haven't, or vice versa. It's called a judgment of learning, when someone is self-reporting whether they've learned or not, just from, do I feel like I've learned or not? And humans are really bad at judgments of learning, it turns out. We don't know what it feels like. You don't kind of get a tingle in the back of your head when you've learned something. So it's hard for us to know if we have. And this is where I'm going to tell you, I've never told this in public before, but I'm going to tell a really shameful, to be honest, tale. It's like a horrible, horrible thing. But it sticks in my mind when I think of judgments of learning. And it's a story from long ago, mid-2000s. I was an education officer at a big science centre with a desk with all the detritus that comes with that role. And as part of my job, as I'm sure all you have as well, I had to do a half-day first aid training course. So as you do, we all went off into a meeting room, and we had a guy from St. John Ambulance, which is a voluntary organisation, really, really good organisation who do loads of first aid training and first aid provision across the UK. And I sat there, and I hadn't, in my defence, I hadn't been long out of academia at this point. So I'm good at learning stuff. I was there with my notepad, and I was ready to kind of suck up a load of information and data and bullet points and flow charts of if A, then B, then C, and learn about this topic. But it didn't happen like that at all. So it was all a bit it felt all a bit woolly and not enormously directed, that we'd read bits from a book we were given, but we'd just read little bits, not really get into it. And then he'd tell some stories. And then, of course, we did practical bits as well. But it all felt not enormously directed. And there wasn't very much density of information being transmitted. So at the end of the session, you've got an evaluation form, as you do. So back in those days, I was even more tactless than I am today, and I can be quite blunt, for which I apologise to those who've been on the wrong end of that. But also, this is an evaluation form. It's really important to be honest, because that's what they're for. So I filled it in, and I very honestly communicated that I didn't think the training had been necessarily run particularly well. It didn't really work for me. And I folded it up, put it on my desk, and the guy came around and he picked up the form, and then he turned away from me, back to me, and he walked away from me into the middle of the room. And as he did, his pace slowed a bit, and he looked down, and I saw his arm move as he opened up my form to look at it. And he looked at it, and then his shoulders slumped down. And it was horrible. It was so horrible. And there's so many reasons that shouldn't have happened. Obviously, he should not have looked at the evaluation form right in front of me. He should have had all of them together so he could put it in context. He should have not been in a position to be so disappointed by one person's form. He should have known that some people are quite tactless. But it was really awful. But the other reason why it should not have happened is that the training was actually really good. I just didn't realize it. Because what I found is in the days and weeks, months, the years afterwards, those stories he had told us kept popping back into my mind, and I'd think them through and run them over and recall the information and rehearse possible scenarios. And in fact, what he'd done was brilliant, but I had no idea when I filled in that form that this was the case. So I feel I would love to, I don't know, if I knew who he was, I'd send him a bunch of flowers and a bottle of whiskey or something, because I feel terrible for that day. But I shouldn't have been asked that, because judgments of learning, people are terrible. People don't know if they've learned things. And in the flip side, something I'm sure we've all experienced, is the superstar lecturer. So have you ever been to a lecture, especially if it's a topic you don't know about already, and the speaker is amazing and they speak so fluently, they have a wonderful narrative, they explain it all so clearly, it all makes sense, they have perfect diagrams to support it. It's a wonderful experience. You come out buzzing out of the room, and then you get in your car, you drive home, and you see your partner and you go, oh, the lecture was absolutely amazing. I knew nothing about that topic, but I feel like, oh, it's the whole world has been opened up for me. And they say, well, what did they talk about? And you can't remember anything specific. There's nothing in your head. It's all been washed through. It's gone in one ear, gently caressed your brain, and then popped straight out the other side. And one of the links I'll give you is to a study like this, where, they show that lecturers, students will say they're wonderful because they lecture so fluently. But in fact, no, you need to be thinking if you're going to learn stuff. So judgments of learning, people are way, way, way off. So I want to explain why we're so bad at it. So here's my little, I feel like I'm covering loads of ground here. It's all right, you're all very clever. Little model of how we learn. So I'm going to explain with the judgments of learning why we're terrible. So the way we learn, so you get information coming in, your senses, you get input, and then you have your working memory, which is like short-term memory where you process things. You're more kind of conscious of what's going on in there. And again, I'm talking about learning like knowledge and skills, not effective learning or anything like that, kind of academic learning. So you crunch everything around in your processing area of your working memory. And then to actually learn it properly, it needs to be put into your long-term memory and encoded there. And then to be able to use it in future, so you've properly learned it, you need to be able to retrieve it again for future use. And we can see the input, so we can go, oh, this guy's a great speaker. You know, he's got wonderful body language, so therefore we can see that. We can see the processing bit, so we can go, oh, this all makes sense, this all makes sense. But what we can't feel is the encoding. And until we try to retrieve it, we won't know whether that's possible either. So things that help potentially, firstly, with the processing, what you need is to be able to thinking it through, turning it over, lots of processing. The more you're processing it, the more likely you'll remember it. And that means you should be thinking hard. It's effortful. If you have cognitive dissonance, if this doesn't fit with your worldview, then you could either ignore it, which people are great at ignoring it. But if you're forced to think about something that's cognitively dissonant, then you're going to be thinking even harder about it. That's all really good. So if students say, oh, it was really hard, it was really confusing, these words can actually be indicative of really good learning. Obviously, they can be bad as well, but they're not necessarily bad things. To encode it into your long-term memory, what you want is to have loads of links with things that you already know before. So like with the first aid guy, so he told a story about a child at a festival. And firstly, I had to invent the kind of scenario in my mind, imagine the scene, which takes work. But I was using memories of festivals in my head to create the scene. So it's linked in to those, and that makes it easier to encode. And also if you have value. So in this case, obviously you have the avoiding harm value, which is really high. It's a tip of something you can do if someone is injured. But also if you can just use the information at the time, then that will demonstrate its value, and it means it's more likely to be encoded. And then someone mentioned retrieval practice earlier on with the pyramid, really important. If you don't practice retrieving it, firstly, you won't know if you've learned it if you don't retrieve it to demonstrate you have. But also you need to learn how to retrieve it. And the more you retrieve it, the easier that will be, and the more useful it will be to you, and the more likely you are to remember it for longer. So I'm wondering what will happen if I click on this again. So in terms of judgment of learning, the problem is that lots of these things are not very popular. So people don't like cognitive dissonance, they don't like thinking hard, and they don't like practicing retrieval. It's like a test, isn't it? People hate tests. And if you test someone on the topic, they'll lose all confidence. Oh, I didn't get 100%. I must be terrible at this. I didn't learn anything at all. Whereas in fact, the act of retrieving it means they are likely to remember a lot more than someone who wasn't tested at all, who may be supremely confident that they remember everything, but in fact will not. So this is a kind of difference between what people think is good and what actually learning is like. And I don't know about the US, but in the UK, there's a big push to talk about all of these metacognitive processes with students and explain to them about this so that they can then choose better study techniques and get a better understanding of why the teachers are using particular techniques. Now, judgments of learning, it's all a bit depressing if you're trying to evaluate an event. So this is a big problem. That how many times have I done an event and then given people a questionnaire saying, did you learn anything? I've done that loads, and it's totally pointless because they don't know if they've learned anything at all at that point. So there are things you can do though that would improve their judgments of learning. So I thought I'd throw some tips in here to not be too depressing about it all. So the main thing is to just wait a while. So if you think, when I came out of that lecture with my head buzzing, if someone had given me a questionnaire at that point and asked if I learned anything, I would have ticked 10 out of 10. It's amazing. But by the time I get home with my partner, if I'd had the same questionnaire, I might have tried doing a bit of retrieval and realized that maybe I hadn't. And what you want is time for them to basically wash through their short-term memory. So especially if they're thinking about other things in the interim, that will help and speed up the process. But best of all is if you can actually test their recall, because how much they think they can recall will not be how much they can recall. And there's lots of ways in which people get misled and will get it wrong if you ask them just to predict if they can remember it rather than actually testing if they can remember it. So that is my 3 myths. So we had Dale's ridiculous, well, not Dale, poor Dale, ridiculous pyramid, the corrupted cone. just thinking about why do we believe things? What sort of things feed into our credulity? Learning styles, why do we keep believing things even when they've been disproven, and the mental hoops that people will jump through to keep on their path of what they believe. They don't want to change their beliefs. And also our judgments of learning, which is about how it can be quite hard to actually know what success looks like, to evaluate different techniques for us to be able to work out what is the learning myth and what is genuinely helpful in learning. And that brings me to the end. And I think I'm pretty much bang on time if I subtract Alan's sneaky question. Like I said, we got loads of time now for questions or discussion. I'm happy to talk about anything really. Ooh, I was trying to go back to this. Anything that you're interested in. So I don't think there are any questions in the chat box. So Alan, what's the best way to do this, do you think? Can people put questions in the chat or just chip in?
This is well, both actually. You can, if you want to write in the chat. This is not different learning styles. This is different participation styles. Some people like putting things in the chat, and some people
kinesthetic
like
people put your hand up. Reading, writing people can write in the chat. Yeah.
But it's actually a small enough group. I think people can just unmute if they have a question. And I would just, well, first of all, I want to say that was a great talk, and I think that was really wonderful. Very interesting stuff. And I think we can throw it open to discussion now.
I can see lots of hands are up actually. So should we work our way through the hands to start with so everyone doesn't talk at once? So, hands going down now. Oh, they're all, what happened?
Those were, maybe they were applause hands.
Oh, were they? Okay. There I was thinking I had a load of questions. Susan, that looks like a real hand.
Yeah, it's a real hand. I'm so grateful for this because you've touched on so many things that in the past have created cognitive dissonance in my own activities in a way, because I actually am planning to do a workshop for LIPS. And it's on developing lab activities for things that we learn in the planetarium. And I'm thinking, well, not everything can, how can I massage this topic to turn it into a lab? And now I'm not going to do that. So it felt very tedious and awkward and like I was making something up, and I was actually doing that. It is not appropriate for all concepts or activities to be turned into a lab. So you just reinforced what I already knew but was fighting against.
This thing, if you have the experience, you kind of, I mean, I've just been telling you not to trust your gut instinct, but if you're experienced, then you can listen to that, you kind of know what is likely to work, and trying to fit yourself into kind of external structures, it's not always very helpful. I think it's good to have those ideas to make sure that you're considering them all as options. Like with learning styles, consider all these things as options and use the ones that are going to work. But to be forced into it is, yeah.
Right. And the same thing happens in a classroom sometimes, where students are angry that you're presenting something in an active way, and they just want you to tell them. They just want a lecture.
Less effort. It's hard to learning. It takes effort, and it's much easier just to ignore what someone's saying than to be forced to think.
Or just, I'll read it and I'll regurgitate it, and I don't have to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, people think it's the teacher's job to teach me, and the teacher needs to give me the knowledge, and they miss the point that the learning's happening inside here. This is where it all happens. You can't be slotted straight in. Yeah.
Anyway, great talk. Thank you.
Rosemary. Yeah.
So I remember going to a lot of educational workshops, being told all of what you've said. And I also remember like being told it was important to provide something for each type of learner, which for somebody who teaches is just, not really what I wanted to do. But there are books by Richard E. Meyer. Is that someone who you're familiar with in
Yeah, he
the
does
proper use of multimedia?
yeah.
And the one thing I remember is like for visuals, not to overwhelm. There's in each mode, I suppose there's a certain amount of information to try to put forward, and different types that you can use for best purposes. And he seemed to have a pretty good take on that.
Yeah, with the input to the working memory, so there's two main routes. So there's one that is more visual. Think of it like a little sketch pad that you're writing stuff on. And then the other is the phonological loop, which is like if you try to remember a phone number and you rehearse the number in your head, and that will take written language and it will take heard language. And those are kind of the two main ways of getting stuff in. And so you can kind of get extra benefit by using both, but you're absolutely right. You need to limit the amount that's going in either route. You need to limit the amount that's inside your working memory at one time. So having lots of distractions is, not helpful. It's a balance. It's really, there's no perfect way of doing it, but it's interesting to think about these factors and then to kind of find a balance. But it is an art, I think, teaching.
I think Philip has his hand raised.
Yes, and I'm sorry I have a busted camera. You don't want to look at me anyway. Excellent talk, Jenny. And much like the St. John's ambulance instructor, while you were talking, you reminded me of quite a few things in my past history as a teacher and as someone who'd gone to workshops and so on. So a lot of what you said are reinforced. I will remember for a long time the things you talked about, because you engaged my brain in the mental work to relate that to what I'd heard before, which I thought was fantastic. So I think you've redeemed yourself with the St. John's ambulance experience that you went through by sharing that with us and then improving all of our learning. I did want to mention, as a Brit now living in the US, the Center for Astronomy Education at the University of Arizona has been doing workshops on how to teach Astronomy 101, as we call it here, at the undergraduate level for quite a few years. And they do emphasize not just different ways of teaching, like lecture tutorials and ranking tasks, but they always tell teachers to share the reasoning behind all this metacognitive stuff with the students. And one of the reasons for that is so that the students don't hate you. Because I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was, but as somebody just mentioned a short while ago, yeah, the students will show up to a class and they think, well, this is the contract. You tell us stuff and we write it down. And one of my good colleagues, who's an excellent teacher, she got a rating on the Rate My Professor site saying, this teacher is horrible. She expected us to do all the learning ourselves and didn't teach us anything. So, what do you do with something like that? And of course, those kind of comments do eventually, for many of us, feed into evaluation for promotion, tenure, that kind of thing as well. So it's much better to explain to the students up front, this is why I'm doing this, and this is why it's going to hurt a little bit. But anyway, thank you. Excellent talk.
Thank you. No, it's horrible. The whole concept of student evaluations is it's just complete filthy trash. It's awful in every way. And I have massive sympathy for anyone who is subject to that. It's awful. But thank you very much for saying you'll remember it, because I'll tell you, there's nothing more scary than designing a talk about learning and memory, because you're aware that you should be using all of these techniques. But obviously it's quite hard to think about it all in practice all at the same time as well. Any other questions? Andy.
Yeah, first, thank you very much. This has been really, really stimulating. I look forward to watching this again with my wife, who is one of those people that puts herself in a box. So see what her reaction is. And yeah, even if I only remember 2% of this, I'm better off. Yeah, I was curious about your opinion about the use of technology and how that works into things these days. You know, the example you gave was, you know, remembering a phone number, and nobody does that anymore. So I'm curious about that. I'm curious about learning amongst people who may be hearing impaired or visually impaired, and is there any research on that? Well, I've got tons of other questions, but I'll just leave it with that.
I don't know anything about these things. So in terms of the effect of living in a more digital society and how that affects things, I think the thing is, this is all exterior to your head. So I think I'm probably most interested in what happens once you have information inside your head. So whether you get something through a screen or through a person talking or you read it, there obviously is a bit of a difference, but the main learning processes inside your brain are still the same. And we're all humans as well. So our brains, in that sense, our brains are really similar in how they act, and you can actually get a better handle on it than kind of sociological things that just scare me a little bit because it's so confusing. But yeah, I don't know about the whether if you're blind or deaf, how that affects things. I mean, I could wibble on, but I would be talking just random things I've heard rather than anything I've actually read about, so I probably shouldn't do that. Don't know, it's interesting.
Well, and I'm recalling a story, the daughter of a friend of mine, well, I'm friends with her too. She was in art school and was asked to help out at a school, and their assignment was, you know, get a picture of a eagle or a bird or something and turn it in. And they all had iPads, and all they had to do was, you know, search for an image on the internet and draw it on the iPad. And they didn't have any materials in the school, you know, paper and pencil and paints and stuff like that didn't exist. So yeah, I'm kind of curious about that. But the other thing I would ask is, you know, how this applies specifically to people working in planetariums, and any advice for us as a group.
I think with your first point, I've decided now, I reckon, so all of these digital technologies are basically, they've created new ways in which to be a bad teacher. But they've also created new opportunities to do good things too. But yeah, they can lead to people doing bad, lazy things, but that's not a problem necessarily with the technology. It's a problem with how it's being used. As far as planetariums go, one of the things with planetariums that I always kind of think over with all of this is the difference between, you know what I was saying about the superstar lecturer, where it's a wonderful experience, but you don't actually remember it afterwards. And with a planetarium, I think there's always the tension between that entertainment and information components, and especially because I worked in a science center rather than a college. And was it more important that those kids came out of the planetarium going, wow, I've had a really positive experience to do with science, space is awesome? Or is it more important that they come out having actually learned, oh, there are 8 planets orbit the sun is a star. And you do different things. I think if you have one or the other objective, then you would take very different paths to how you run the show. But the problem is that a lot of shows are kind of asked to do both at the same time. And then you end up with all these conflicting objectives, and it's really tricky. So I think that's probably one of the worst things about trying to, how do you pin down your objectives and make them realistic, so you don't end up with a show that's compromised in both regards. But you have to balance them for how important each is, I don't know, but they don't work together. there are lots of examples of where they fight against each other.
Yeah, there's an old saw that kept coming through my brain during your talk is people don't remember what you said, they remember how they felt.
Yeah. Hopefully they do remember some of what you said in the planetarium, but yeah. Don't know. Depends what you're trying to achieve and how you teach it.
Jenny, I just remember I retained what you said before your talk started, that you wanted me to put references into the chat. So I put them in just now. There's a set of references that are that Jenny has prepared in relation to her talk, but she didn't want to put it out there while she was talking. So so now
minimize distractions for your audience. It's very important. With the, it's just like 2 sides of A4. If there's anything in particular you were interested in or wanted to know more about or get pointed to some references for, then you can just email me and I can, I'll put my email in there as well. I'll put my personal emails in.
I have a comment. Actually, it's you mentioned in your last EduMyth. I especially like that, the learning process you described, the input and the processing and the encoding, the difference between immediate or working memory and the longer term memory. In a curriculum project that I've been working on, the FOSS project, Full Option Science System, they've been using the term that they're using is sense making. And they have determined, I should say I work with them, think that it's really important to allow time for the students to spend time in sense making. And that can be a number of different things, but a lot of times it involves having discussions in groups and trying to process what's been taught or what they've experienced. It could be a lab, it could be an investigation, or it could even just be a lecture or some slides. But to have time to sit and talk to your friends about what it meant, so that we call that sense making. And I think that is what is related to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it does a load of really good things, because it's firstly, you're kind of pooling your knowledge and make it, and so you can pick up errors that other people have. But also the fact that you have to put it into words is forcing you into the more analytical, less gut instinctive way of thinking. So you're forcing people to, they might feel they know something, but when they try to put it in words, they realize they don't. And I was going to say another one as well. What was my third one? I guess it gives you, and then it's retrieval, isn't it? That you're retrieving bits of information that you knew before, and you're finding new links and you're using it and it's being useful in the conversation. So it just ticks loads and loads of boxes. And I think some people think there's just something, I don't know, I think sometimes group activities, that's the benefit isn't necessarily that some magic about the group, but it's all of these things, and particularly tipping you over into analytical thinking. I think it's a huge part of it. And it's active, and I mean active, not physically, I mean mentally active, which is what you need to learn things. So yeah, it's really hard. I was aware that I was talking loads and throwing huge amounts of information out, and it would have been better, like, I don't know, if we'd done questions after each session, you probably would have like preempted loads of things I was going to say and thrown me off.
No.
But,
when you were talking about retrieving, what I thought of was use it or lose it. There, that phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rosemary, you have.
So another question. I used to worry a lot. I was in a volunteer effort. We would put weeks into it for a one-day event for girls. And it would always bother me that there was no follow-up. And I worried the same thing about planetarium programs, the one day, the one classroom visit. and then they're back to their classrooms or whatever. So are there people who work on trying to do some way of repetition, something to keep that recall active after the planetarium visit is over, either suggestions or things we can give to the teacher, and if she participates, that's fine, or things that we could put on a website and try to encourage students to come back to?
We used to do that at the planetarium. We had pre and post visit materials that the teachers could download. In reality, I don't think they were used hardly at all. And I always had a thought, and I've not done it in practice, and it would be very costly in time. But whether there's some way that you can do the planetarium show and then give them like a challenge to go and do some sort of project and just have a really quick Zoom, so it doesn't take forever, with the class, where the class then can present to you what they've done. And the fact that they then are presenting it to the planetarium person would give a lot of motivation and a kind of point. And you could give them some materials for the teacher to help them do that. And I wonder if that would be more of interest. Although often the planetarium is just, it's a school visit, and the fact it's a planetarium isn't even important, and it's just a tick box, and they've got stuff planned for all the rest of the year anyway. I don't know, not sure. I think talking to teachers really about what they would practically use is the main thing, because you can make wonderful things, but if the teachers in your area aren't set up to use them, then it won't get used. But yeah, it's a really good, it's a huge, yeah. Yes, it's an enormous thing for planetarium shows. The one-off nature is not helpful.
Yeah, that.
So maybe we shouldn't try to teach content at all and just do the fun stuff, because they're not going to remember it anyway.
I've got some coming up, and I'm going to let the teachers tell me. I mean, they can choose from a list of things, but if the kids are learning about tides, then it's good to throw in the tides. If they're learning seasons, throw in the seasons. And but you know, if they just want a fun visit, I may throw some stuff in because I can, but it kind of depends on what the teacher wants for the outcome, I think.
I used to chat to the kids outside and ask them if they've already done anything about space and what have they done, and just while they're queuing up, and talk to the teachers then, because it can be quite hard, and in terms of admin, you don't want to be trying to phone up everyone who's booked for the next week. But yeah, they're so different, and some of the groups it's new to them, some of them they're coming at the end of the project as a celebration, and you can pick up on it during the show, but it's really helpful to have a bit of a heads up, isn't it?
If I could jump in quick, one of the things that I agree with what's being said, and that some teachers have that expectation that it is just a show and it is just entertainment. And then there are other teachers who have come around and realizing that the planetarium is a model, and we're using that to help understand and deepen under what is happening, and that students can make observations and students can actively see how things work and how things go together. Now you also have the opportunity to talk about or point out how models are not perfect and what parts of the model, aren't exactly right. But I am a teacher. I'm housed in a school district, so I have built in all of these pre and post support materials. And they get used to varying degrees, and but it's then just perpetually saying, hey, this is here, and by the way, your students are using iPads in the planetarium because they've got challenges to do, and then I can get feedback. And the nice thing for me is when they're using their iPads, even if I'm asking them just to draw something, I can stand in the back of the planetarium and I can kind of see quickly what they're drawing and if we still have misconceptions or not. So that's one way that I've been thinking about and trying to encourage teachers to think about too, that we're here using a very special technical model that gives kids an experience and an understanding in ways that nothing else really can. And I have to do virtual visits sometimes too, but my sense is that it doesn't work quite in the same way because it's not quite the three-dimensional experience, but I haven't collected data on that. So that's all.
I think it's good if you're in a planetarium, you should be doing things that you can't do not in a planetarium. So yeah, totally.
When I first started teaching, and all through my planetarium career, I was working out of a science center where kits were sent out to the classes, and they were doing a unit on astronomy. So the planetarium was either a pre-unit visit, during the unit visit, or after the unit visit. But I started experiencing so many times where the teacher would take the children out of the planetarium at the end, and then she'd say, right now, when we get to the classroom, open your math books and go to page 51, you know, things like that. And oh, it just irritated me so much that they were treating it as such a one-off kind of thing that I started giving the students something to think about, and they would actually bug their teacher to do it afterwards. So many times I would say, okay, so why does it matter what we learned? What is it in your life that can be affected by the things that we learned today? And make a list of 10 things when you go back to your classroom to thwart that, you know, change over to some other topic right away. Right away. It was my little way of getting.
Did those teachers ever come back again, Susan?
Yes, they do. Well, they were booked every year, you know, so they didn't have a choice.
They knew what was going to happen. It'd be nice to be able to kind of almost force it in and have our planetarium show starts with you doing this thing that you've pre-organized. And then afterwards, you know, and have it as a, you have to do this whole thing, which includes pre and post. But the problem then is it's just too hard for teachers and it's going to put some people off. And the people it puts off are probably the people who will benefit most from coming. And yeah, it's tricky. So did anyone subscribe? Someone mentioned it already, actually, but how many of you believe these learning myths at some point in your career? I think I definitely believed learning styles. I definitely believed that people were able to judge their own learning. And the pyramid one, I think I definitely never used it, but I was kind of, I think I probably was unsure about whether it had any meaning for a while. Because the other thing, if you do subscribe to them and then discover they're not real, is it's interesting to think about how that feels in your head. And especially if you've used some of these things with kids, it can be, I think, quite hard to give it up because then you have to accept that you were perhaps not doing the best you could for them as well. But the whole thing of giving up misconceptions is interesting because that's what we're asking people to do when we're trying to reteach the phases of the moon and stuff. And we're just as prone to them as anyone else. It's just that this is our specialism. So we're more aware in this particular area.
I think the learning styles one is the most prevalent. I have definitely encountered that and didn't really think about whether it was valid or not. I just thought it was hard to do.
I did a little experiment before this. I went and did a Google search for learning styles at .edu sites, the US universities. And then I literally just went through the pages and results in the order that they happened to come up for me and marked whether they were selling the myth or whether they were debunking the myth. And about 70% of them were selling the myth. And you think, if you're not sure and you search and you're looking and it's a university site is telling you this is real, you should be using it. That's what you get. And it wasn't the psychology departments who were saying it. It was some of the education departments were selling it still. And some of them were just random blogs of people who happened to be at this university, so had that in their URL. But if you want to fact check it, what are you going to find?
I think we're about ready to wind up here. If anybody has any last minute burning questions, might speak or forever hold your
Or
peace.
email me later.
Again, this is a great experience, a great talk, and a great discussion. And if any of you want to unmute and applause, please feel free to do so. It was really, really good. Thank you, Jenny. It's wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me.
That's great.
You're free to
Good to see
go.
everyone.